We straight away get into today's edition of the Pmrc Radio Corner. I'll be your host until the end of 25 minutes. My name is Kachana Sinyani. I have in studio live my guest from Policy Monitoring and Research Center, Mr. Akabondo Kabechani. Good morning, sir, and welcome to the radio program.
Good morning.
It's great to have you after a while.
Oh, yes, we always happy to be here.
All right. Now, the Policy Monitoring and Research Center has been conducting research in the energy sector since 2014. And since then, we have had a power sector crisis of 2015 as well as 2016 that saw Zambia experience daily 8-hour power cuts due to low water levels at the main reservoirs for hydroelectric generation, triggering a power deficit of 34% of demanded electricity. Normal service seems to have resumed in Zambia's electricity sector, and recently the secretary to the cabinet and chairperson of the ZESCO reforms implementation team in a press release stated that, and I quote, government has commenced implementing measures aimed at transforming ZESCO into a more effective and efficient public utility company. With this in mind, would you like to share, please share the progress that has been, realized? Where, is the country in terms of progress in realizing these aspirations that have been outlined?
Right. Thank you very much. I think we have made significant progress as a country in trying to reform the energy sector, and in particular the electricity or power sector, if you like. Pmrc, I think, has been very instrumental in implementing policy reform in the power sector, and particularly we have been doing a lot of work, I think, since 2014. I think spanning about 6 publications on policy and research in the power sector to try and help inform government decisions in terms of trying to reform the power sector, I think, which has had challenges for quite a while. I think the most fundamental issue, of course, is has been the issue of tariffs and how to implement tariffs, and of course this has not been the only problem, I think, that has been faced by the electricity sector. I think there are a number of other issues, and some of them, I think, the government, as you saw from the last statement from Secretary of the Cabinet, is trying to address some of the financial challenges, I think, that have plagued our power sector, and in particular the off-taker ZESCO. So when you look at the power sector, of course, some fundamental problems remain, and if we do not address these, I think we may pay a heavy price in future. So we have embarked on more research. On the 5th of December, we'll be releasing another paper on energy roadmap, delivering Zambia's energy needs, which I think seeks to find other solutions that the government can take in leveraging on private sector investment in the energy sector, thereby reducing the burden on finances. So you will notice that while public utility financing has traditionally been, I think, the largest source of investment in the power generation in Zambia and generally in sub-Saharan Africa, you will see that independent power producers are now growing rapidly. I think from 2015, we have noticed even huge growth here in Zambia of independent power producers coming in and trying to rebalance power sector supply. So I think this is the starting point. We, as PMRC, I think, are proudly sitting at the pedestal of energy policy reform, and our work, I think, speaks for itself. Last year, we conducted a distributional analysis looking into the effects of removal of electricity subsidies on small and medium-sized enterprises as well as households, and I think this was the first attempt by any institution, I think, to try and conduct a distributional analysis. And we, as Pmrc, I think, are proud of our work.
All right, in case you're just coming on board, welcome, and let's stay together until 9:50. I'm still talking to Mr. Akabondo Kabechani from Pmrc. He is Head of Monitoring and Evaluation. Now, what are some of the challenges, if at all there are, that Zambia could be facing in attracting investment in the electricity sector? And if they are there, how can government come through and mitigate these problems?
Right. The first challenge, I think, that has been problematic for us as a country to attract investment in the power sector has been, I think, low tariffs. So last year, of course, we moved as a country to adjust tariffs by about 75%. Noting in mind, of course, that subsidy in the power sector does not benefit poor people. I think this is something that a lot of people, I think, miss along these conversations that we've had about power sector reform and increase in electricity tariffs. It must be made clear that poor people don't benefit from electricity subsidies. And so what we did when we first conducted our subsidy reform and subsequently gave advice to government on how to proceed with increasing tariffs, was we were able to establish that poor people consume roughly about 225 kilowatt hours, I think, which led to setting of the lifeline tariff at around 200, which is reasonable. But even then, with this problem, I think we still have fundamental challenges, because the lifeline tariff is applied to every household, regardless of income status. So this is one of the policy issues that we would like to address going forward. Some of the challenges, of course, that you will see, rise in demand. We see that power demands are rising. Industry is growing. Households are growing. There's new infrastructure that is coming up that requires energy. So if you look at the forecast by the Ministry of Energy, we are set to reach roughly 2,800 megawatts by 2020 and 4,000 by 2030, while the 7th National Development Plan estimates that we'll be at 3,525 by the same period. So we see that we have insufficient capacity. That is one of the problems. The second is over-dependence on hydropower, which makes us vulnerable in case rain fails. I think we are sitting, in terms of hydro capacity, we are at around 83%, somewhere there, of installed capacity. And so also you will notice that our biggest hydropower sources, Kafua Gorge, Kariba North Bank Extension, including Itezi, are all drawing their resource in terms of water from the same basin. And so when you look at history, 1991, 2000, 2014, you notice that roughly every decade we usually suffer from low rates of rainfall, and this affects, I think, our generation supply. So it's important to address some of these challenges.
We are still on the Pmrc Radio Corner on ZNBC Radio 4 as every Thursday between 9 and 10. We get to talk to an official from Policy Monitoring and Research Center. Today, I'm privileged to talk to Mr. Kabechani, Head of Monitoring and Evaluation. Now, what is the role of the private sector when it comes to investing in Zambia's electricity sector?
Of course, the role of the private sector is something that it's very clear. I think the private sector is supposed to fill in the gap. I think the gap that can't be met by the state in terms of energy supply is supposed to be filled in by the private sector. So if you look at the 7th National Development Plan, again, there's widespread agreement that Zambia has sufficient resources, actually plentiful resources for electricity generation, including hydropower, solar. You look at biomass, geothermal, and coal as well. So the challenge has been to try and get investment in power plants that can convert, I think, these resources into useful electricity. Right now, there's no shortage in terms of pipeline projects. We've got IDC Solar going on there in the multi-facility economic zone. We've got Mamba Thermal, I think, which is once it starts operating at full capacity, we expect roughly about 300 megawatts from there. We have Chipata Thermal in the pipeline. We have Muchinga. We have Kalungwishi. We have Kafue Gorge as well. So in terms of power supply projects, I think we are overwhelmed. I think what is important is to try and bring in private sector investment and release the pressure, I think, of government in terms of trying to invest in these energy projects.
All right, thank you so much. Now, ZESCO increased electricity tariffs, as you alluded to earlier. The last one was in 2017, was it?
Yes, 2017.
It was actually done the increment was done in phases, the one that went up to 75%.
Yes.
And the public is very expectant of a new investment. Has this actually been actualized?
Of course, new investment on the part of ZESCO is ongoing activity. I think the government has done enormous work in trying to push investment in power sector generation. This has been, I think, very expensive. Of course, the ability of ZESCO to undertake new investments has, to a certain degree, I think, been constrained by its ability to raise capital, which in turn, I think, is linked to its financial situation. So a major potential factor affecting ZESCO finances and has been in the past, I think, how cost reflective tariffs have been. There are processes, of course, one of them being cost of service study to try and resolve some of these challenges, as well as the diagnostic study that was completed and is being chaired by Secretary to the Cabinet to try and resolve some of the challenges. But there are other, I think, key pieces of policy documents, I think, that have been drafted. One of them being the multi-year tariff framework, which I think helps to try and resolve some of these challenges in terms of trying to draw tariffs. But of course, it's important, I think, to note that when Pmrc did its first work, I think, on tariff reform in 2017, I think we highlighted a number of issues which we felt were very, very important and for government to address in terms of trying to get state-owned enterprises, including ZESCO, to improve their efficiency up as part of the package of trying to reform tariffs.
All right. It's 09:39. We still have time until 09:50, and we're still talking to Mr. Kabechani, the head of monitoring and evaluation from Pmrc, on today's Pmrc Radio Corner. Now, how can government then accelerate private investment in the power sector?
Well, there are a few important tenets in private sector investment in energy, which are very important for government to follow. I think one of them is the issue of planning. One of our first lessons, I think, from experience in a number of countries, is that planning is very important for minimizing costs for consumers and making the most out of independent power producer investment. So ideally, such planning should use tools that consider both generation and transmission, and then identify supply and demand side investments needed to meet projected electricity demand at the least cost, of course, underline least cost, over a certain period. Typically, these projects, I think, if you look at these contracts, typically they are 15 to 20 years. So while also meeting associated policy objectives such as environmental sustainability, it's important that we have effective planning. Experience suggests that effective planning also involves, I think, input from a broad range of stakeholders, and this is meant, I think, to have, I think, solid planning. The other issue that is important, of course, is procurement. For planning, I think, to play a useful role, it must be translated into appropriate investment and procurement decisions which encompass both the public and private sectors. So when you look at African countries, they have an explicit connection between planning and procurement, and this involves, of course, input and clearance from up to 5 different actors. You can look at government, you can look at the ministry, you can look at ZESCO, you can look at the regulator, energy regulation board. So it's important that we, I think, improve our procurement processes. Of course, lately, recent donor-backed programs such as the Scaling Solar and Get Fit have effectively offered, I think, a streamlined and simplified process in which some useful IPP bidders have benefited from standardized power purchase agreements and packaged information about the best locations for some of these grid connections. So it's important. I think the third issue is creditworthiness of the off-taker, which largely speaks to one of our policy recommendations, which highlights the importance of improvements in the efficiency of state-owned enterprises. You will notice that in many African countries, state-owned utilities are mainly off-takers of electricity from IPPs, and most of them are in poor financial shape, most fundamentally because tariffs, of course, are not cost-reflective, meaning that utilities cannot cover their capital and operational costs. So also because of some losses in distribution lines and the poor record of revenue collection, and a combination of factors which I think lead to utilities losses. So you will notice that potential IPPs will perceive usually substantial risk in such conditions, especially the risk of non-payment if the utility is financially fragile. So one important step I think that we are taking is trying to reform ZESCO to try and make it more efficient. This is very important for independent power producer investments. Investors generally feel safer if the off-taker is in great financial shape, because then they know that their investments are safe and they're likely to recoup their returns on the investment.
All right, as we wrap up our program, Mr. Akabondo Kabechani, obviously you and I will agree to say the public perception about ZESCO's performance remains poor, and there are some complaints about service provision versus cost of tariffs. Okay, what is the Policy Monitoring and Research Center's view and advice when it comes to these two, poor service and complaints that keep coming through when it comes to service provision by our utility, electricity supply company?
Of course, from the onset in our work, we set out, I think, some policy recommendations that are useful for government, ZESCO, and the regulator, in this case, Energy Regulation Board. One of the important issues to note is that, of course, when you get up to reform tariffs, tariff reform should be part of a comprehensive reform plan. So as you reform tariffs, you must make commitments to increase supply. Secondly, you must have a good communication strategy with transparent access to information, which is very vital. Usually public perception changes if your communication is very good. Secondly, you have to have mitigating measures to protect the poor. We moved to raise the lifeline tariff to 200 to protect the poor. And also, energy pricing should be depoliticized through independence of the regulator, in this case ERB. And I think the most important thing is, of course, the efficiency of state-owned enterprises needs to be improved, and in this case ZESCO, because improving the efficiency of ZESCO can reduce the burden, I think, on government, and then improvements in efficiency can also strengthen the financial position of ZESCO and reduce the need for government to continue pumping in money into the off-taker, in this case ZESCO. So when you look at country experiences, I think they highlight the importance of strengthening governance systems and improving demand management and revenue collection in most of these state-owned enterprises.
All right. Unless otherwise there is any other information you'd like to share with our dear listeners, we have 4 minutes on our side, but this is where we come to the end of our program for today.
Right. We have a lot of work going on in PMRC. Most of our publications can be accessed from our website, www.pmrczambia.com. So please visit our website and have a look at a lot of work that we are doing. I think this is useful for national debate. I think we can debate with facts and then have constructive discussions from most of these publications.
All right. I'd like to thank you so much once again for your time, Mr. Akabondo.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right, dear listeners, this has been today's Pmrc Radio Corner with Mr. Kabechani, Head of Monitoring and Evaluation from Pmrc. My name is Kachana Sinyani. We end the program here. Join us next week for another one. Thank you very much for listening. Good morning.